Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I'm interviewing Yves Stevens. Yves is a writer and also hosts the YouTube channel Yves the Poet, which offers book publishing tips and reviews of writing tech. Yves, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, yeah, I want to talk to you about a lot of things kind of related to writing and technology, which I think is very pertinent today. But you cover this idea of technophobia in the writing community. And I want to start out talking about this video that you did recently about how back in the day, people freaked out about the typewriter and how that's equivalent to people today freaking out about AI, like in the writing community. Tell me a little bit about that and how you came up with how you discuss the typewriter as a thing that people used to freak out about, which is kind of funny to think about these days.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good way of putting it. So I don't really know how like what prompted me to look this up, but I love typewriters. And I was kind of interested in I was just looking up stuff about typewriters and I came across something on how like the Remington typewriters, which they were either one of the first, I think, iterations of typewriters. They also, I think, were like a firearms company back in the day. A lot of the people who are on the board of directors of Remington and the people who really first were behind this big push of getting typewriter beginning the whole world of typewriters were actually there's a lot of quotes from them where they express a lot of anxiety around bringing this invention into the world, which I thought was so interesting because today when we look at typewriters, they're seen as one of the more mundane or mild or and beautiful, right? And sort of this ancient old artifact of how writers have sort of developed technology over time. And so kind of just there was a little bit of for me, that was surprising to hear that people were afraid of this technology in a lot of ways. And they thought it was really going to, which you can argue it definitely has, disrupt the system, both for writers and just for tech in general. But now when we look at it today, we just see it as something that's really cool and beautiful and, has helped writers in a lot of ways, but is definitely kind of older archaic compared to some of our modern means of getting writers to write their books and finish a really big masterwork or something like that. Like a typewriter is sort of not always the first go-to medium of tech that we use today. So
You
I
know,
know that's a lot, but it's interesting to me to hear that.
my one of my thoughts about this when I was watching your video is that we almost don't properly freak out anymore about technology like we used to. You know how you hear these stories about for who it was, but there was some symphony or whatever that was played back in the day where it was kind of atonal or dissident or whatever, and people left the theater screaming, sort of thing, and just and that's freaking out about some sort of a paradigm shift in the art world, but it made people genuinely terrified. And I imagine that when people were kind of scared of the typewriter, if that's at all analogous, they might have actually been kind of sort of freaked out. And it's weird to think that technology progresses so quickly today. When we quote unquote freak out about something, it's more just kind of we tweet oh, this is bad. And then we go about our days, right? No one actually freaks out about anything at all ever, right? Is that kind of your sense too?
No, I think that that's a really good point. Sort of, I guess the way I see it is we talk about freaking out more than we are actually freaking out.
Yes.
That I don't want to get too into. I feel like this conversation so just organically goes to AI,
Yes.
and I don't think it has to because I think there's so much in the way of writers tech that doesn't even AI is one part of that. But I do, to your point, think there's something to the fact that when we talk about AI in a anxious or worried way as a collective, we're sort of just talking about it. We're not really always doing the research or pointing to links or talking about interesting companies or experiments or laws and regulations. We sort of just sit in this conversation of oh, wouldn't this be weird? Or oh, that's totally freaky. But yeah, I think some people probably worry about it more than others. I guess I'll just leave it at that. Some people probably have a bit more of that panic or anxiety around developing technology than other people do. And I can't really say, like
I've seen
yeah,
maybe one instance of this online where, do you know Ayla Girl?
it sounds really familiar. I just can't, it's hard to put the picture. I'm like a very, very visual person when it comes to the
Okay.
Twitter and all
I feel like
YouTube.
you should look her up because based on your Twitter presence, you might enjoy her content. She's
I,
hard to describe, but she does a lot of polls and she's um she 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 tweets a lot of things that are very like you know she's an influencer in the traditional sense that you kind of follow her life and what she's up to. And she tweeted somewhat recently that it just hit her that AI is actually going to completely disrupt everything. So she stopped saving for retirement. She does everything she wants to do. She doesn't hold back in life at all. She's just completely like flip things around. And that's maybe the one case of someone who, and she's like a rationalist. She's part of the rationalist community who like,
okay.
I don't know, I guess is rational. I don't know. Like, have you seen anybody like that who is actually changing their lives based on new technology?
No, I
Okay.
can answer that definitively no. What I've seen more of, and I'm going to be more, I don't want to get into like my personal, what I, do for my, like my 9 to 5 kind of stuff, but I can say I've seen some of like what companies and how businesses are reacting to those spaces, probably more than individuals in terms of, so I'll give you an example of like, I've heard about a lot of companies, and I don't know, like I can't point to anything in particular, but a lot of companies sort of like creating their own proprietary like AI systems, or figuring out ways, right, to like make sure that they're using and incorporating AI into their robust like business practices, right? Those types of things I hear about more, not as much individual cases of, I certainly know people who use AI for maybe for YouTube, for video editing, for things like that, but it's less of a like less of an obsession or like a restructuring of someone's whole life. I think that that's really fascinating, but I just don't have any personal like examples of it that I can think of. I'd have to probably think on that a little longer.
Do you think that the writing community in particular has some technophobia at its heart? Because I mean, like there's this romance to being a writer and just to sitting down with a pen and paper. I mean, I still do this. Like it's very romantic to be able to do that. And I think that people feel that they're being truest to themselves as an author when they're sitting down with like zero technology. And I want to get into like what you do of like reviewing writing tech in a second, but just kind of like broadly speaking, do you think that there's a lot of hesitancy in the writing community in particular versus maybe other, well, maybe it's just, I'll have one more little like note here is that I know a lot of musicians.
Hmm.
They are so down to try out like whatever the new tools are and to incorporate them in their art. Writers like kind of sort of not so much. I mean, writers, I know some people who are, write all the time and have never opened ChatGPT, just like or just no interest, or maybe if there's interest there, it's like a fear-based thing, so they just like avoid it. So like in my life, I do see writers being not the people who are like way stoked about revolutionary technology like ChatGPT, et cetera. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so I love the way you put that. I think romantic is the perfect way to put it. I think that writers, and this is maybe what makes us a bit different from musicians and other types of art, is that writers tend to be, writing is a solitary pursuit. Not that music can't be, but a lot of times we have bands, we have people like aggregating together to create music, whereas like writing a lot of the time, even I've written something with a co-writer, and even that was like a really solitary effort still. It's solitary and it's also slow. And so I know a lot of people don't like Haruki Murakami, but I'm gonna throw this in because his
I
book
love
is really
Murakami.
cool.
People don't
All
like
right,
him.
okay, okay.
Screw
I'm
them.
into the surreal, and so are you
Yeah.
apparently, like from what I've read. So his novelist as vocation, I'm reading this as part of a book club with it's Ian Kadanak is on YouTube through his book club, and Write Conscious. So I'm reading this and he talks about how writing is it needs to be a slow effort for a lot of people, because when we get in our heads too much about it and we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not active, and we're just in this world where we're trying to write so fast, it can be problematic. And I think the typewriter actually was, for a lot of people, seen as something that slowed their minds down. You can correct me on this, but it helped people to take their time with their writing. So I promise I'm getting back to your point. This is just how my brain works. But I think this solitary, slower way of being, it sort of makes us a little bit more hesitant by nature to be reaching out for something, like whether it's an AI tool, or even I do reviews on like things like Scrivener and Novelpad and things to help build Plotter, like help people get organized just with their tech. And I think we just tend to be hesitant to reach out for those types of tools, not even necessarily AI. Like, forget that. If you're just hesitant, you're totally not into it, but just simple types of tech, because we want, we know it's important to take our time. And going back to that old, like, nostalgic feeling of having pen and paper, it's the muses are speaking to us, right? We need to we need to connect with whatever that is for you as a writer. When you want to connect to that, I think it's natural for people, because this still, I grew up in the 90s, like pen and paper is how I did it. So that's how I connect. And I find a lot of people now reaching out for tech that mimics that kind of nostalgic, like the Remarkable or the books tablet, these tablets that are like, they're basically just ways to get the feeling of writing on paper, but to be still connected to your computer and your Google Drive and whatever it is. So like, even though we have all this tech, writers just don't want to. I 100% agree. Writers want the romance, and they want to live in that old world feeling of connecting to their muses. And I don't see anything wrong with that, but there's a little bit of like, we got to kind of take some steps, right, to sort of like just see what works for us. And there's nothing wrong with either way.
Okay, let me throw an idea at you. I feel like some of the technology that is used most by writers, alcohol, marijuana, and coffee. What do you think? Are those technologies?
Hate all of them personally. I don't
Okay,
indulge.
but there's
I don't
no Hunter
indulge.
S. Thompson. There's no
No,
Hemingway. Like without alcohol, and I've written some of my best shit. Like
but
little
it
tipsy.
to be fair though, a lot of like what I used to, and a lot of us writers, it's like we kind of go back into the right, like into our memory banks of like different experiences that we've had. And even if you weren't engaging in some of those, like for me, I don't drink, but I definitely, as a writer, I know the importance of connecting with my subconscious and allowing my subconscious to do what it needs to do. And sometimes that gets wild, and it's
Yeah.
hurt. Sometimes it's hurtful, or it's painful, right? So like allow ourselves to go into those spaces. So however you want to do it, I'm not here to tell people, but like, I'm just like a not a cool. I'm
Here's
like
a
totally,
formula. All right, 2 glasses of
I'm
wine.
totally, yeah, yeah, yeah. For some people it is, and that's it. It kind of is actually. It's a good word to use, formula. Like
Mhm.
writers, probably a lot of artists, have their things. Like we just
Yeah.
have our routines. And for some people, that's having a cup of coffee at the local cafe. For some people, it's you are a Charles Bukowski, like going out and doing wild things. And like, I don't think it really matters what it is. I think just knowing yourself, I think being healthy is really, I'm on that camp of trying to be really healthy. But as a writer, like you got to do what you got to do. And I do think a lot of people have things that they sort of cling to, of like a routine or their ways of connecting with that part of themselves that's a more like buried down, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah. So, okay. So jumping into some of the technology that you've covered, which frankly, I've never really used, but you've talked about, okay, Remarkable, Notepad, Scrivener, I think some cover design software. Maybe like the one thing that I've totally used is, are you familiar at all with Final Draft for writing screenplays?
I've heard of it, but never used it. I'd be so interested to learn
It
about.
is amazing.
Oh, really?
Because screenplays have to be formatted in a very specific way.
I'm sure. Yeah,
And
yeah.
if you try to use Word, it's basically impossible. Like best case scenario, it's an utter nightmare. But with Final Draft, you just start typing and you hit like enter and you hit like tab and those you like enter and tab the only things you need to know about. And like you can write a screenplay perfectly formatted every time. It's so
Love
utterly
that.
incredible. It's so seamless. And screenplays, a novel, it takes you a good year usually to like, or whatever, more like 5 years sometimes. You should be able to write a screenplay in like 3 months. So it's almost like you gotta have a program like this. If you do not use Final Draft, you are not in the game, like effectively as a screenwriter, which is very interesting. So, and every single screenwriter uses it. Like there's no exceptions. Every single person uses it. And like it's interesting because I have been writing, fiction my whole entire life. I have actually never heard about. I've heard about Remarkable.
Mhm,
I think I've heard about Scrivener. I'd
mhm,
never heard of a Novelpad.
mhm.
So I've gone my whole life without needing these things at all. Sell me on some of these programs or
Sure.
tools
Yeah,
and
and so
why you
I'm
think that they might be useful for a writer.
cool. And I'm just gonna caveat this, like not financial advice. I don't work for any of these companies. I don't like this is just I'm going to give you my 2 cents from what I've tried out and what I've explored. And I agree with you. Nobody needs any of it. Okay? And it's important to recognize that because part of especially if you want to do this yourself, if you want to go into self pub or more on the indie pub side but you're like really big on marketing yourself, it can get pricey and it can get
Mhm.
really expensive. And becoming a writer, as if you want that, if you want to be a novelist especially, like to be constantly churning this out and going into your subconscious and doing these things and living this kind of a lifestyle, it shouldn't be costing you all this money, right? And I hate that. That's why I'm kind of like, I don't think that any of these newer tech are necessary to be a good writer. Really having like paper and pen and writing and doing the actual act of writing is that's the only way you're gonna start writing stuff. So
Mhm.
that's the caveat. But um if you can try out some things, I do think there's a lot of value in the organizational aspect of technology for writers, especially if you're doing this yourself. You're trying to hire an editor, maybe online on like Fiverr or Readsy, and you need them to read your stuff, and you're trying to communicate all these big ideas that you have about your plot, and maybe you're writing like a fantasy book, and you have all these this world building going on. You need a way to organize it, and you can do that with paper and pen. Some people like note cards, and that is awesome. But I find that I think like things like Plotter, Novelpad, a lot of people love Scrivener. It's kind of old school, but like if you're living in that world, it can be a great tech for you for like decades. You could just use that and be happy.
What's
Being
the
able
what's
to,
the process of the novel one? This is I'm not familiar with it. Like how do you use that as a writer?
yeah. So
Novelpad,
I
is
would,
that what it is?
yep, Novelpad.
Yeah, okay.
So pretty much like the way it works is that it's an outlining tool. Let's call it that. I'm going to call it that, an
Okay.
outlining tool. You can write your entire manuscript within their interface. So their UX is very clean and simple. I'm trying to compare it to something that I don't know. You go in and pretty much like you can just start writing your book. However, its outlining features allow you to zoom out, right? And chapter by chapter, scene by scene, beat by beat, if you really want to like get crazy with it, you can see it in a either like you can organize it like landscape, or you can do like horizontal or vertical kind of view of the chapters of how you're setting things up, and you can also kind of move things around. And it sounds really simple, but having that on someone's desktop or on your mobile phone, if you really want to, I personally wouldn't. It would probably be a little too granular for me. But having that can be really helpful for people, especially since now we're mostly typing things on our computers anyways.
Yeah.
And it backs up to a cloud software. So if you're comfortable with that, if you seek that out, you can export it yourself, but also just having that flexibility is kind of nice for a lot of people. Just being able to feel comfortable that it's getting backed up and you don't have to like I manually back up my manuscripts if I'm working in Microsoft Word, and it if I don't do it, I get really uncomfortable worrying I'm going to lose stuff. So those features are nice to have. I'm not saying
Does it kind of
otherwise.
like push you into having a certain formula at all, or like a certain like particular like 3x structure or something like that? Or
That's a good question. It doesn't. That's a good question because I think that that's something if these companies really wanted to like jazz up their offering, I think that they could probably do like structure it in ways where like based on whatever formula you're trying to, if you're a genre writer, you
Mhm.
could probably it might be cool if they had like here we can like fix your manuscript or like show you ways to make your manuscript fit in better with like a 5-act structure. That'd be cool. I don't know of anything that does that currently. I know Plotter is actively looking to integrate AI into their functionality. No idea how. My guess is that it's more for prompting, which like that is cool, but like again, I haven't seen any of this stuff, so I don't know. I probably wouldn't. I just don't like using AI for prompting, but it would be interesting to your point if the formulaic aspect of writing was like with any of these new technologies, like could sort of explore that within that. I don't know of any that do, but all that is to say, if you're just using these for plotting and you are a structure person, like you're a formula person, say you're like use the 7-point storyline arc or whatever it is, or you know, the hero's journey, especially for genre writers, this is a big one. If you do follow those, personally, I think those people tend to lend themselves more to an outlining process. Like they tend to seek out more, I could be wrong, I would think more outlining structure and tech that kind of like grooves with those kinds of, because they're, if you're fitting it into a formula, you're going to be doing some plotting ahead of time. And you can still be a pantser, but you're going to be like trying to look ahead of time how to structure things. And so it's helpful to have an outlining tool if you're looking at it that way.
do you
Out of time. I just got a thought.
yeah, just in the interest of time, do you have any thoughts on NFTs for authors? I know that you've done a couple of videos on Bitcoin, etc. I know that there is a little bit of an NFT community. I run into them on Twitter every now and then, where they try to sell books as NFTs. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is not financial advice. I was doing some video like sort of video chats with someone in the space, Alchemist Poetry on Instagram. His name's Chris, and he was teaching me, this was like years ago, probably 3 years ago now, about like ways to not only use NFTs in the monetization of and promotion of and marketing of a book, but also to sort of like make, you know, connect it to the physical book itself and to have that interplay of like a physical book that's also something digital that people can find value in. And again,
So
this
is this
is
like
not.
is this something like there are 100 NFTs in the world? When you buy the NFT, you also get a book sent to you? Is it that sort of a
Yeah,
thing?
yeah, something, yeah, basically, you could do it in a lot of different ways, but I think that's probably a more the most like familiar model. I personally like I haven't done this. I've owned NFTs, I've traded NFTs, but I didn't go down that path when I chose to self-publish. But I could see it being a great way for people to create that sense of community. Like I was mentioning to you before on Twitter, I see like with all these different Terror House and New Right and all these different like smaller publishing companies and groups of people that have to do so much work of marketing and actively like you're online and you're talking to people and you're selling your book. It's a lot of work. It's very different than the traditional publishing model. It's a little more
Right.
like guerrilla, like you're like really out there.
Yeah.
And so I do think like, you know, I'm going to caveat this. I get a lot of people are just going to say like the NFT scene is dead. They don't feel like it's going anywhere. They don't see the value in it, and that's fine. But I also see the model of something that is digital and ties the digital experience and community to your book as being a very helpful way to market when a lot of times we got to do this work ourselves. Like we're really bootstrapping ourselves as writers, especially in indie publishing, self-publishing. if if you want to get more than like 5 people buying your book, like you have to put in a lot of work. So there are creative ways to do that. I think NFTs would be interesting, but I personally haven't done it, so I don't want to like be
Yeah,
promote or like I don't know.
my 2 cents for whatever this is worth is that I've dabbled in NFTs just for fun when it was like a hyped thing. And I'm kind of like irritated because like I have a couple of those like, wallets or whatever. And I've got like money sitting in some of those. And like the other day there's like the rainbow wallet and I was trying to like figure out how to get money out of there. And it was such a huge process. I was just like, screw it. Like whatever. That money's just gonna sit there, I guess, for eternity. So I don't know. That turned me off on it. But like last question. I want to jump to our last question or last couple of minutes here. What do you think, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, what do you think the writer world looks like? Are writers using ChatGPT for every project they ever work on? Can you tell when someone doesn't use it and you're like, wow, this idiot doesn't use ChatGPT and these tools? Or do we totally shun that and like the writing community just kind of like shrinks and there's a hardcore group of people who only write pen and paper and like that's it, and there's like you know cred, social cred in that. Or what do you think? Like, let's go 5 years out. What do you think the writing community looks like, and the reading community too, perhaps?
Great. So I have a couple things I don't want to miss. First of all, I think it's just going to be, sorry if this is like a not exciting answer, it's going to be much more obvious what has been created by AI versus what isn't. Right now, there's a lot of that technophobia, that fear about we're nervous that because we can't tell the difference and we can't authenticate things. And that is like it's kind of freaky when you extrapolate on that. But I think that in the future, I think we're just going to find ways to like either label or make it more obvious, like when something is using AI technology versus not, or maybe it'll be easier for us to spot it, like just naturally. I don't know, but like I've already been seeing on so many platforms for publishing, like you have to click a button which like this is, on our system, but you have to indicate whether you've been using these technologies or not. And
Yeah,
it's
I've seen that
interesting to me. You know what
on
I'm saying?
Amazon's KDP. Before you self-publish a book on there, you have to click, like, you don't have to, but like it asks you, did you use AI for this? And
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And so all of that, right? Like I think I'm just more guardrails, probably, I think, or more like labeling. And then also to answer your question about whether or not this is like shunned in the I think that as writers, the more you write, the more you realize how deep of a subconscious journey this is for the individual, but also the collective, for groups of people. When we are writing, we're just like really going through this rebirth and this like it's just a crazy experience. I can't, like, if you're a writer, you just know how to, or an artist of any kind. And because of that, I think that what AI does is really fascinating. I do think there are some scary things that could happen if we're not nurturing this in a way where we're making kind of clear boundaries for ourselves. And like, if that comes down to us as human beings and as collectives, as like putting those parameters in place. But I do think there's something to be said about just like the writing process is so human. It's so human
Mhm.
that to me, like, I just don't, if someone uses like a prompt for something, that's great. But like the images that come up in my writing come up again and again because they're part of like my past and part of who I am and probably part of like maybe like ancestry beyond that, right? So I just see it, it's interesting. I don't know what the future has in store, but I'm hopeful that like at the end of the day, communities of writers will just maintain that beauty of the creative essence that is like a very human thing. And how that interplays with AI is like, AI is an extension of us. We're creating it. So we'll
Yeah,
see, you know.
great point. And maybe my 2 cents here is that I
Yeah, I want to
think
know.
that I've heard writing described as the most effective and most purposeful way to think. It's very intentional
Yeah.
thinking. And
Yeah.
so I think that in a sense, writing isn't going to change fundamentally until the point if and when we ever do get that like Neuralink implant in our brains where all of a sudden our
I'm not.
thinking is or when our thinking is augmented, then that's going to be like the true paradigm shift, I think, in the writing process. Until then, I think everything is a tool that some writers will probably, as they already are, like shun, while others embrace wholeheartedly. But it's going to be fascinating to see. And yeah, I'm excited to see what else comes up on your channel in terms of writing tech. That's something I'm very interested in. And yeah, you've got a lot of fun Substack accounts out there, and a lot of great things we didn't really have a chance to talk about. Maybe next time. But Yves Stevens, thanks for coming
It
on the
was
show.
really,
And
really great. Thank you for having me. Well
yeah,
said.
thanks, you
That's a
too.
good way to put it.
All right.